Hi, everyone. I am Sandra Whitehead. I am the Program Director of the Sustainable Urban Planning Program here at George Washington University. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the first in our Salon Series, where we are exploring different urban planning topics with thought leaders in that area. And so tonight it's my privilege to be joined by two experts in the urban planning and brownfields redevelopment field to talk about a paper that was recently published that encapsulates the last 30 years of brownfields research. So if you're not familiar with our program, we are a master's program at George Washington University, where we are focused in on training the next generation of urban and regional planners who are going to be responding to climate and equity. And our philosophy around this is to really focus in on understanding the impacts of planning, policies, and actions on the triple bottom line, on people, place, and prosperity. We are, as I mentioned, a accredited planning program, accredited by the Planning Accreditation Board, and we are ranked by Planedison among small programs and private schools. For the webinar this evening, we welcome your questions and input. If you want to put those in the chat, we will be answering those towards the end. We have a presentation format, and then we'll take questions at the end. And by way of introduction, it's my pleasure to be joined this evening by my co-authors of this paper, Doctors Ann Carroll and Chris Sousa. Ann is with the Office of Brownfields and Land Revitalization at the US EPA, a long-term partnering collaborator of mine, and she also is an adjunct professor here at George Washington University. And Chris is with excuse me, with Ryerson University. And Chris has a long history of brownfields research and practice dating back to his early days of practice in the United States. So it's an honor and a privilege to have Ann and Chris come and talk about this paper and that we wrote about brownfields research, and to talk about what is next and what's open on the horizon for you as a new brownfields researcher or a student who might be interested in brownfields research. So now we'll start the formal presentation part of it.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Ann Carroll. The first slide I have to tell you isn't really a slide that I'm going to change. And I will come into the definition of brownfields. But for those of you who aren't familiar, brownfield, you might have heard about a Superfund site. You might not have heard about a brownfield. Well, a brownfield site is the property, and this is a statutory definition. There was an earlier definition that we don't have a slide on, but the statutory definition is a property, the expansion, redevelopment, and reuse of which might be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. And that was a law that was executed into law in 2002. And we often talk about the presence and the potential presence, because some of the sites that actually receive brownfield attention aren't actually contaminated above a risk threshold. So that's where brownfields might be different from other kinds of legislative or regulated sites, like Superfund sites, like landfills, like other contaminated properties that you might have heard about or be familiar with. And so this is a particular one in East Millinocket, Maine. But to back up, that's what a brownfield is. What about brownfield research? Well, because it's both a contaminated site as well as a potentially contaminated site, and the program kind of came to pass because of other kinds of issues that were facing communities. There's long been interest in research, and so This is why we did this article, but also why we kind of realized in the course of talking about the research and trying to kind of identify the gaps and the breadth of the work was the Brownfields research over the time of the Brownfields program, which started in the mid 1990s as a kind of pilot program, went across planning, law, environmental chemistry, public health, in environmental justice literature as it evolved, as well as environmental liability, a lot of legal and policy journals. And so with that kind of wide spectrum, we thought it was a really important time 30 years in to kind of take stock of that literature and really identify some of the gaps. So I will turn this over. Just go to the next slide so you can see some other brownfield examples that are reflected in that legislation. So in addition to those potential presence or contaminated, there's also abandoned mine-scarred lands, sites contaminated with petroleum and controlled substances or meth labs, and petroleum often considered abandoned gas stations. So I think I hand it over to you. Oh, and some other kind of examples. So for those of you who aren't familiar with brownfields and would like to learn more, there are opportunities at GW on that. So I think this one turns it over to you, Chris.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for inviting us here today, Sandra. It's been great to work with you on this project. So basically many of us researchers, both professional practitioners and academics, we often meet at the large Brownfields conference. These conferences have been going on since the late 90s. I think my first was in 2001 in Chicago. We started in about the mid 2000s talking about the role of research in the development of policy and what research needs to be done, what research has been done. And so we've talked for forever about writing a paper that kind of looks at this literature over time, and Anne was able to finally get us after the 2019 conference to start working on this. And Sandra, myself, and Anne kind of actually started getting it done, which is great to see. So we really, as a group, we had a large group we are the coordinating group, and then there were a large group of researchers that actually participated in the writing, and then there was a larger group that advised us on literature and ideas. So we divided the paper essentially into 4 parts. The first looks at the beginning of the program and policy, the early policy period, and then we divided up into economics and real estate, environment, and social equity and health. So I'll be talking about the early policy and the environment, the real estate and economics and environment part, and Sandra, if you want to jump in, can talk about the health and equity. So what you see early on in the Brownfields literature are these shifts that are pushing literature research to be done in certain areas. The first shift is the focus from the most severely contaminated sites throughout the country, the fears over the love canals, large properties, to the more pervasive, lightly and potentially contaminated sites impacting communities. So in a way to take away the stigma from just this being the baddest of the bad, and focus more on the brownfield. So the term that we used was often contaminated sites shifting into brownfields. There was also a shift in focus from understanding and addressing contamination challenges more from a science point of view, and that shifted to what are the broader challenges inhibiting investment in cleanup and redevelopment. A lot of the mayors in the Midwest, Rust Belt, East Coast were seeing these sites lay idle because of a lot of the liability and cleanup concerns, and the need to shift the conversation to focus more on redevelopment. So from a clean it to a reuse it perspective, from an environmental problem to more of an environmental opportunity to recycle land. And also, the important thing was to identify not just the stakeholders who are affected by this, but the broader array of partners that are needed to understand and develop policies, programs, and tools to address cleanup and redevelopment challenges. So it really, you saw a big move from people pointing fingers and staying in their silos to a joint effort to understand the problem and how do we work together to solve it. And in terms of the literature, some very important work came out. Charlie Barch, who the paper is dedicated to, in the Northeast Midwest Institute, and a variety of academics. I'll talk a little bit more about them in the next slide. So the early research, what is a brownfields? What is the definition of brownfields? How many are there? And where are they located? So again, folks like Charlie Barch, Northeast Midwest Institute, EPA, ICMA, a bunch of organizations really trying to get a sense of what are brownfields. You had the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the Government Accountability Office, academics like Robert Simons at Cleveland States, starting to count the number of these less contaminated, more pervasive, potentially contaminated properties throughout the country. And the numbers amounted into the 400,000 all the way up to 1 million. Again, not focusing on contamination and contaminated sites, but more as places for opportunity in urban centers that we could build and reuse that had existing infrastructure. So the U.S. Conference of Mayors really pushed the reuse of existing infrastructure, existing space. And so they did some of that early work. Are brownfields being redeveloped? And if so, which ones, where, and how? What are some of the... What happened? Sorry. How do we securely take a brownfield from the point of identification to cleanup, redevelopment, and closure? So again, if we are interested in redevelopment, how do we take a site from contaminated to it's safe to redevelop to redeveloped? And to do that in a way that the users, the lenders are confident that all is okay. And lastly, for the early research, why should public sector effort and investment be employed to help address this issue along with private, nonprofit, and community partners? So the why should the EPA and other partners be involved in participating in this kind of activity? You had a lot of research groups and institutions appearing in the 90s and early 2000s. I remember when I was in the 90s, started working on this, you had folks out of Rutgers, Michael Greenberg's shop, Louisville, Peter Mayer's shop, Cleveland State, Deborah Lang at Carnegie Mellon, Georgia Tech. So you had a lot of institutions and a lot of researchers at those institutions kind of coming together and looking for questions that needed answering and starting to answer those. So next slide. So a group of us focused on economics and real estate, and the questions that were explored in late 90s, early 2000s and on. First is, what is the impact of potential contamination on properties surrounding neighborhoods and the market? To get a sense of the negative implications of allowing these sites to lay vacant and underused. What are the economic barriers, costs associated with brownfields and their redevelopment? To get at the issue of what's inhibiting their reuse. What can the public sector do to help overcome redevelopment barriers at all levels, federal, state, and local? And what are the economic benefits of cleanup and redevelopment on and off sites? And are these benefits equitably distributed? So, if you, in order to have that public intervention, often you had to make the case that the intervention was contributing to erasing negative implications and bringing about positive outcomes for communities of all incomes. And so it work by Charlie Barch, Sarah Coffin is one of the co-authors, Marie Howland from Maryland, Peter Meyer from Louisville. That early work really set the tone for making the economic case for reuse, as opposed to what had been causing a lot of problems in the 70s and 80s, which was the economic case for not reusing these sites. So this early research was essential for helping to make that economic case and for helping to make the economic case for government support to get these projects, to help them to get done. Next slide, please. The environmental research, obviously early on, there was conversation of environmental benefit, primarily with relation to cleanup. But as I mentioned early on, the original work was how many brownfields do we have? Where are they located? How big are they? All that was one of the original concerns. And then it shifted to how are we reusing these lands? So what's the scale of land recycling activity? The whole idea of growing inwards and not outwards, showing the opportunity that brownfields pose. So that was a lot of the early work, just getting a sense of how big of a problem are we doing, do we have, and how big of an opportunity are we engaging in. Some research then started focusing on what are the environmental benefits associated with developing brownfields, particularly versus greenfields. So why, again, should we reuse these lands as opposed to building elsewhere? And so that was very important for really creating an agenda to stop sprawl and focus on infill. Early research starting in the early 2000s and what are other environmentally oriented alternatives to conventional real estate development on brownfields. So I remember early on being looked at like I was an alien when I started to talk about parks and open space. There's a lot of parks and open space work since then and has done work on urban agriculture. It's another area, renewable energy, solar facilities on brownfields, natural preserves. So I'm taking a group. We're hopefully going to see fresh kills in New York. A great example of a landfill to natural area. So this kind of work starts to emerge in 2000s, really as another alternative to conventional real estate. And then the last point there is how can we situate brownfields within broader sustainability framework and consider environmental and social equity implications in addition to economic ones. So really pushing, we had become very successful at changing the conversation from environmental liability and cleanup and risk to economic development and real estate. And now we needed to push that and broaden it to environmental benefit as well as social equity and public health, bringing that into the conversation again on a site-by-site as well as overall basis. Okay, Anna, I think you're up. Sorry for talking too much.
Sorry, you gave great context. And I think the key thing that Chris has been involved in this longer than I have. So I come to it from a different research perspective, but also as a practitioner as well. And so one of the things, even as we're looking at the literature in this process, we also realize how little of the practice is actually reflected in the literature. And so I think that's really why Dr. Whitehead wanted to bring this to you, because you, as both practitioners and researchers in your current roles, might be interested in this as a topic for your own work. So again, not only here are these abandoned areas of disinvestment, what kind of job growth and economic opportunity are there that will result from brownfield activities, either in the assessing, identifying them, as well as cleaning them up, and then even the revitalization, maybe the building or construction whether it's for building structures or, as Chris was mentioning, green space and recreational areas. How can local job training build community capacity to participate in revitalization? So that's one understudied area of the Brownfields program. The EPA awards Brownfield job training grants. So the unemployed, underemployed, ex-offenders, veterans, and others can actually get those skills to launch that career. How can that impacted population, the neighbors to these sites, the residents in those communities, how can they be involved in brownfield redevelopment decisions? Do they have sufficient information? Are the communications about the activities culturally appropriate, or are additional things needed to better strengthen them to be part of the decision? And then how are the brownfield benefits of redevelopment distributed? That is always an underlying concern in the brownfields revitalization space. Next slide, please. So the research needs are boundless. Should this be an area of interest for you? Next slide, please. And so in addition to the economic and environmental research needs that I think Chris has talked to a little bit, obviously, as we think about these individual properties in a larger expanse, how are we broadening that focus, and how are we thinking those research needs more on an area and planning perspective basis? The retrospective analyses, over $1 billion in grants have been awarded since the beginning of the program. How have those projects gone? What more planning lessons and other research lessons can we glean from those activities? And in the social equity, again, who is getting the benefits of that activity? What is the community level activity that we can be doing and building the capacity of the people who live there, and at different timescales? So what in the short term to be a part of the process, and what in the long term to change economic prospects for communities? Cumulative impact is a big issue right now, both in environmental justice, equity, and public health space. So how do we think about not just cumulative impacts experienced in communities of disinvestment? What of those cumulative impacts can we actually change? And, because we know it's both what we've inherited and how we've been raised, well, some of those things we can't change, but we can certainly make conditions better for the next generation. And so what would be the key things to target in that revitalization? And again, thinking about not just wealth to some, but wealth to many across the brownfield communities. There's been a lot of attention, and this is a domestic article. We've certainly had conversations with our international colleagues about this, but tools that are developed by researchers aren't actually accessible for community members sometimes. So how are we tailoring tools so they're building kind of community agency, community knowledge, and their participation? So community accessible tools is a huge area for attention. And again, how are we setting up those dialogues so that people identify potential brownfields, know how to get involved in it in their own capacity, and then what are the kind of research methods we really need to do, both to push the research forward, but also capture the practice more completely. Next slide, please. Equitable development is, well, that should actually be across all of those columns, because it has the economic, the environmental, social equity, and kind of combined effect. But how are we, if there is in fact an inequitable distribution of the benefits of brownfields, how does that get rebalanced? Chris mentioned urban agriculture and community gardens, because there was a mad push in the 2008 when fuel prices went up and food prices went up. And that has since kind of re-emerged again with COVID. But how are we thinking about these urban spaces as areas, not just for food and agriculture, but all the other kinds of agriculture, whether it's fuel or fiber? Maybe people are uncomfortable with getting food there, but there are certainly other marketable crops that will also contribute to that greening, that shade, and that revegetation that we need in urban areas. Community engagement, and as I mentioned in the column, it also will be a better way to protect our drinking water supply and also address some other vulnerabilities that communities face. Again, community engagement, again, community-led engagement, because this isn't only for the local government, this is for NGOs and community-based organizations. And so what are the scales of that engagement? And there are examples around the country of communities that are actually driving the brownfield revitalization process. So how do we balance the actors to create the most just outcomes? Obviously, the adverse effects of gentrification, industrial displacement, and economic vulnerability are key areas that new solutions and new policy and planning approaches need to be developed. I think the sustainable materials management, how are we recycling rather than demolishing? How are we reusing those materials? Because they have a lot of embodied carbon, but also life cycle analysis. Maybe there's other kinds of property and material transfers that would have even more kind of economic employment and environmental benefits. Tribes and territories have been understudied, both in our own domestic research and internationally. And so that's certainly an area of research gaps for those of you who are interested. The impact of the alternative areas of brownfield redevelopment. And Chris mentioned that he was one of the early researchers on green reuse. But what are the other kinds of reuse? And not just one, but multiple players. We have a lot of multi-use redevelopment. We have increasing attention to renewable energy as part of other kinds of redevelopments. But there are other kinds of ways that we've encouraged and kind of laid out what peers are doing, whether it's turning a brownfield into a community health clinic in a medically underserved area. Food production, we've already mentioned. Renewable energy certainly is of the moment. But there are others, no doubt. And some of you, no doubt, will help us come up with them. The social network analysis is really looking at, as you're trying to build community engagement, what parts of the community are talking to each other and how do you better maximize the efficiency and the effectiveness? Because everybody should be a part of the visioning process and planning for that future reuse and sharing what they know to create a nicer community for everybody. Next slide, please. I think the next one is parse. Yes. So green job creation and employment. And so, as we are thinking about, as the EPA is thinking about, as communities are leading efforts to put solar panels in mine-scarred land areas and giving the community the job skills and certifications that's going to really help that go to scale. What are the things that brownfields can be doing on their property that can actually be improving water quality, both in surface waters and in groundwaters? And then the cultural communication and the cultural communities, because the community is changing. And we know that the brownfields grant recipients in the past are predominantly communities of color, but we also know that there are less representative kind of Latino-driven or Asian-driven reuses. And so how are the cultural communities driving reuse in a way that they're going to create something that's culturally appropriate to them? And so there have been a couple of different examples around the country, but that's an area for new exploration and attention. Next slide, please. So I don't think we're ready to quite finish yet, but I'd love to hear, and I know Chris and Sandra would, what brownfield research would you like to do?
I should mention that I didn't mention to this group in particular, the first time I ever did brownfields work was during my master's degree for a client-based studio. So this is way back when. So it's as planners, we're constantly trying to understand issues, and these issues evolve over time. And as you can see, we talk about the evolution of, this topic, and it definitely is an area that allows you to focus on various aspects of planning and development, but the core idea is, you know, building inwards, infill, utilizing the land in the best way possible, as opposed to going off into our farms and green space. So.
Well, and I think that this body of work really is young still, right? Like if you think about how other areas of economic development research, right? It's 60, 50, 60 years old, and this is really still developing. And there's so much room for new researchers and new ideas. I want to hear what the audience thinks. Like, what areas did you see on our slides that Ann and Chris talked about that are understudied or that need more work? Was there something there that appealed to you as either a curiosity or as a possible capstone or paper topic? And you can just unmute if you want. We're a small group.
Can we offer participation grades?
I see that Dr. Carroll put some great resources over in the chat for you. We do have a question from one of our alums. And specifically, because I think you have this breadth of knowledge, could you talk about like one of the brownfields that might be local that people could go and see? Like maybe our alums suggest perhaps Kenilworth Park. Do you know if that's a brownfield over there?
I know there's a landfill near there that is a problem. So, not it is brownfield-ish. I take the class that I have taught as a summer field study to Longbridge Park in Arlington, which is a former brownfield, actually a former brick factory and scrapyard. Audi Field, should you be going to a game and want to visit the brownfields while you're there, just walk around the stadium and you've walked around the brownfield. There's actually a new one that we've identified in a couple blocks away from it too. And of course, there's an old power plant there, which we could argue is a brownfield once it finally shuts down. If you want to go and find a brownfield in your area, I've just also put a resource that's called Cleanups in My Community. It's an EPA document that essentially documents the kind of either Superfund, RCRA, brownfield, or other activities that are identified. Now, not all of them have been identified. So those are ones that have already been brought to the attention and have received resources. But there are sites to be identified after flooding, after fires, as our climate changes and we have more extreme weather, what might have been a perfectly, soundly operated facility suffers some damage that results in contamination more widely spread. And so that's where we probably didn't talk as much as we need to about how much more that needs to be done to think about resilience, not just on the sites and in the communities, but maybe we should be checking brownfields in those higher elevation areas that we think won't be impacted by the climate to make sure they're safe should we need areas for retreat and population migration. So honestly, I've been working in this area and I am an advocate for the attention to brownfields in the planning, in the public health, and the policy arenas. But it is a hub in many different areas that we care about for sustainability, for resilience, for equity, and to, create wealth in areas that have been underattended to.
And to be intentional about how the people who live in this area already are included, impacted, and are empowered to lead to some extent.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I see that we have a hand up. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi. Can you hear me or see me?
Hi.
Yeah,
Hi.
hi.
My name is Suki Nang. I am not a student at GW right now, nor am I an alum, but I'm interested in the DRPH program as well as
Oh,
the environmental health aspects. And
mhm.
I have a public health background, mostly in community health, and a lot of what you all brought up resonated with me, in particular the social equity piece. And I'm just starting to learn about brownfields. In fact, I dug up and found your article last week, so I just started to familiarize with this information. But something that has been important to me in my profession as well as my personal life, as an immigrant, is having the community members engaged and uh, really listening to their perspectives and their expertise as well. And, having them involved in the research as well as the interventions and identifying what the best solutions may be. So that's something that is standing out to me and something that I want to explore further.
Well, thank you. I am a DRPH from a nearby institution, Johns Hopkins, but I would love to, help you make the connections if this is an area that you want to study, or, there's an adjacent area of public health interest for you. But yes, all of the better representing the and I think the next question is a little bit about that, about the different cultural communities, the different kind of, we don't talk much about class in this country, but that's certainly a part of the picture. And so, what is going to be the environment of a civic process that is intentional, that brings people in a way that, some people will be engineers and professionals, other people will not have the same skill levels, but deserve to be spoken with and interacted with in a way that's respectful, that builds them their own capacity to participate in a way that's going to, really make a difference in their lives and in their community. So
Right.
lots of work to do in that area.
Yeah.
And I think too,
Thank you.
and one thing that I'll hold out to folks who are actually GW students is that in the spring, Dr. Carroll teaches her introductory class, and in the summer, she does her field school. Do you want to talk about that for a minute, Anne?
Sure. That'd be great. And I've really enjoyed the field school, and I believe the students have. But we actually go to a couple of different brownfields that have been revitalized. Obviously, I'm not taking anybody onto a brownfield. But the idea is looking at the planning context, because there's often such a focus on the site and the contaminant or the reuse planning. There isn't always, both the agency might not have the authority or the capacity to think about all the other planning connections. What are the built environmental improvements that a brownfield can help fuel that can also really make a difference to the community? And so we do some community built environment assessments around brownfields, really to help you think about, if you're going to interact with brownfields communities and programs, how are you helping them plan in a way that's going to be more protective, more resilient, and more equitable? And we have a Michael who has a hand up.
Go ahead and Michael, go ahead and unmute.
And we have a Brooke in the question, and I was going to hand that to Chris if he can.
Go ahead, Michael.
Michael.
We're not able to hear you if you're
Mute.
I don't even want to know how many gas stations we have around this country, but what does that look like as we start to transition away from that type of infrastructure to a completely different type?
Well, so there was an energy audit of gas stations. And I think right now they believe there's 78,000 that might have spills that have been under addressed, but there's, many more active operating stations that, they might have some, whether it's somebody has a spill at the pump or, except it's successive customers having a spill at the pump. There is actually a move afoot to turn abandoned gas stations or gas stations into EV charging or battery storage areas. So there could be a potential future. But in some communities, the small commercial mart at the gas station might be the only food store. And so that has been a whole other kind of reuse potential in food deserts. What could we use on the quarter-acre footprint of a former gas station that could be a short-term antidote for sure, but some other way that we can improve, is it going to be a farmer's market? Is it going to be a kind of local growing? Is it going to be some other kind of community-driven vision to improve food access?
Yeah. They're some of the most challenging sites to deal with because they're smaller. And as such, you can't build your way, your pro forma just doesn't work often. You can't build your way out of the issue with density. So it's a challenge even for strong markets, but it's particularly challenging for softer markets. And so the question is, are there interim uses that you could have as well as, new uses? The fortunate ones are the ones located in prominent corners because usually it can attract, drugstores and other things,
Right.
but it's a challenge because there may be a lot of them coming online.
Right.
So
Yes.
We
So
have-
EV and sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, just like, there are alternatives both in energy, but there's, there are now examples of affordable housing. There's even been moves in some places to turn them into kind of a place for food trucks to kind of go to. And, that would be a different kind of commercial opportunity, but it would activate a space just to kind of have people start envisioning something different than an abandoned gas station that, people are storing drugs above the roof panels.
mhm.
We have about 1 more minute, so I'm going to let Jessica ask her question and then we'll close it out.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for letting me speak and thank you for having me. It's not really a question, it's more of a statement. And I just don't know why we're not utilizing hemp as more of a sustainable resource as fuel and for housing and stuff, because you can have hempcrete. It's also a phytoremediation plant and it can help clean up the ground, like the toxic ground in a lot of areas and everything else. So and
let me
even for
stop you
fuel.
there. Let me stop you there. Phytoremediation, one, doesn't work for everything. There are certainly certain plants that do certain things and can remove or mobilize or stabilize, not mobilize, contaminants. But there's a lot of misinformation on phytoremediation too. So I would ask you to go back to the peer-reviewed literature on that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you everyone for coming this evening. And I especially want to thank Drs. Carroll and Sousa. Thank you so much for presenting our paper and for sharing it with our community and for kicking off our research series. So thank you everyone. And I really appreciate you being here this evening. Take care.
Yes. Happy back
Thank
to
you, everyone.
school. Bye.